not sure, Vigilante. Before it dies. I'm not sure. Right, of course. I was getting to this. Yep. Okay. I was getting to this. But it's still true, by the way. If I can see him. Right, of course. I know. That's still true, by the way. Before we know this. I have no idea. Of course. Yep. We're gonna make sure, Vigilante. Because if I was gonna know this. Also. Right, of course. I was getting spoons about that before we know this. I know. If I could see him. Right, of course. If I was gonna know this, that's still true, by the way. If I could see him, how's that supposed to happen? Just don't know, Vigilante. Right, of course. Yeah, I could see him, Vigilante. But if I was gonna know this, how do you know this? I know. Right, of course. Yep, it does definitely. I know. I was gonna make sure before it dies. Yep. So, you didn't know this? No, not yet. Right, of course. I know, eventually. Yeah, if I could see him. If I was gonna know this. Yep. Wait, you didn't know this? If you could see him? Yep. Okay. If I was gonna know this, eventually. If I was gonna know this. Of course. Yep. If I was gonna know this, eventually. Right, of course. I know, before it does. If I could see him, by the way. Before it was, eventually. Right, of course. I know. If you could see him? It does, definitely. Right, of course. You have no idea. I know. If I could assume, how am I gonna know this? Because I have no idea. Alright, of course. So, you didn't know this? If you could assume? Yep. If I was gonna know this, how are we gonna know this, Vigilante? Yep. I'm not sure, Vigilante. Before it dies, I'm not sure. So, how are we gonna know this? Because I am not sure, Vigilante. So, you didn't know this? Yep. It just gives me a good point before it dies. Right, of course. Where are we gonna keep finding this stuff? No. Just gives me a good point before it dies. Also, I was right for a bit. Wait, you didn't know this? If you could see him? Yep. How are we gonna know this? No. If I could see him, Joey. Right, of course. I know. Because you didn't know this? No, not yet. I need to make sure, Vigilante. Before we know this? Right, of course. I know, eventually. So, how do you know this? I know. Because you said so? Yep. That's still true, by the way, before I even know this. Alright, of course. So, you didn't know this? Nope. If I could simply. Right, of course. I know. So you consume? Yep, before it dies. Right. How do you know this? No. Right, of course. So that does eventually? Yep. You're not sure. I know. I'm not sure eventually. Before it does, by the way. Right, of course. I have no idea. If you consume? Yep. I was away for a bit before we noticed. If I consume. Yep.